BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Nobody had reported a wallaby missing, but a grainy image had made it onto the evening news, confirming that a wallaby was indeed at large in London. We were patrolling Vauxhall when a report of a nearby sighting came in. Our core operation that night was to tackle robberies and drug dealing outside local clubs. Nothing was happening, so we radioed to accept the call and drove away from the lights and music. We pulled up next to a dimly lit row of garages, squinting at the pixelated outlines of bollards and bins, alert for signs of movement. It was almost midnight and the street was completely still. Someone passed around a packet of Percy pigs, and we each took a handful without lowering our gaze, scanning left and right. After 5 minutes, the sergeant decided to drive around a bit in case the wallaby had moved since the caller spotted it. We circled the area for 10 minutes, but found nothing, looping round and round the same few streets. What had seemed plausible when we accepted the call began to feel improbable, and then absurd. A call came out. A robber in a bike, late teens, was making a getaway not far from us. He was an IC1 male, code for a white North European man. The sergeant switched on the blue lights and siren and raced towards Stockwell, pumping the bullhorn at each junction. She turned sharply into the estate the robber had cycled into. "Hold tight," she shouted, and we gripped the headrests in front of us, bracing as the van hit a speed bump, then another, and another. We followed the chase on the radio. We'd been hoping to reach the robber first, but we could hear a response car ahead of us closing in on him. A minute later, they caught him in a car park, and by the time we pulled up, the young man was in handcuffs, blood pouring from his nose. "Honestly, Nathan, that was the worst getaway I've ever seen," an officer was saying, searching through his first aid kit for a dressing. "We're on an estate, I'm in a car, you're on a bike. There are tiny alleyways everywhere. What were you thinking turning in here?" Nathan didn't reply. He had made a sudden turn into the car park and attempted to duck below the security barrier, a daredevil limbo that resulted in him headbutting the pole and being knocked backwards off his bike. Nathan's phone rang and the officer answered it for him. "Hi, yes, Nathan's phone. I'm afraid Nathan's not really free to speak at the moment. He's standing next to me in handcuffs. Yeah, he'll call you back." The situation was under control, so we left the officers to it. As we were driving out of the estate, the sergeant spotted a group of IC3 or black males from the local ABM All Bout Money gang in the stairwell of a high-rise and suggested we do some searches. "We'll go in there, see if it stinks of cannabis, and if it does, there's our grounds," she said, which should be easy because those hallways always stink of cannabis. Half of us went through the front door, the sergeant shouting "Boo!" as she entered. 6 teenage boys ran out the back door where our colleagues were waiting for them. We told the boys we suspected them of possession of cannabis and were going to search them. They spread their legs and raised their arms as though they had been tagged in a game of stuck in the mud. We emptied their pockets, skimmed their waistbands, slid the backs of our hands up the insides of their legs, attempting conversation all the while. "How's your summer been? Have you been away at all? Why have you got 5 phones?" "This has been a bone summer," one boy replied. We didn't find any drugs or weapons on the boys, so we wrote our 5090 stop forms and said goodnight and got back in the van. It was nearly midnight. We were about to stop for a break when a harassment call came out. An IC2 white male, mid-30s, was harassing a teenage girl at the centre of an estate in Brixton. We sped there on blue lights, arriving within 5 minutes, but when we pulled up, everything seemed quiet and calm. We got out of the van. It was a handsome brown brick estate, 5 stories high with a neatly trimmed lawn in the middle. "Over here!" someone shouted. A white female, early 20s, emerged from a doorway and pointed at a silver car on the other side of the lawn. 2 silhouettes just visible inside. "I'm her older sister," the woman said. "Every night for like 2 hours they sit in that car. He's 35, she's 15. It's not right." We walked across the grass, knocked on the driver's window and asked the pair to step out. We're just friends, the man insisted. We're just friends talking. He paused for a moment and looked at the girl. We're both lonely, he continued. We understand each other. He was interrupted by shouting across the courtyard. A tall IC2 male was walking towards the older sister, the man's cousin, who'd come to stick up for him. The cousin and the sister began to argue, and the girl from the car began to cry. I don't have any friends my age, she said. Honestly, we're just talking. We separated everyone, told them an officer would visit to investigate further, and sent them all home. We were overdue a break and drove to the kebab company on Clapham High Street. It felt good to be in a warm, bright room, sinking back into a black leather chair. We sat in silence for a moment, inhaling the roasting meats and waiting for our numbers to be called. Evening, officers, an IC1 male, white, 70s, shouted from his table at the back of the restaurant. You see how I'm sitting here, officers? He said. I always like to sit with my back to the walls so I can see who's coming into a place. I used to be a villain, you see. Back in the van, we did some circuits of Clapham, entering the most soporific phase of the night and waiting for the uplift that comes at 3 and carries you through till dawn. We were on one of the dark roads that cuts across the common, passing Honest Tom's snack wagon, when we heard on the radio that there were about 15 white males throwing bottles and wielding baseball bats outside Honky Tonk on the high street. We were less than a minute away, and we all sat up, suddenly alert, readying our batons and CS tear spray. If we were lucky, we would be the first to arrive. We dashed to Honky Tonk, lights and siren pulsing, and scrambled out of the van onto the pavement, looking around for the men, hands hovering above our holsters. A moment passed. We looked around again. Then we looked at one another. There was no sign of a disturbance. Not a bat or a bottle in sight. On the first day of officer safety training, we meet in the high-ceiling gymnasium. 80% of our job has no violence, they tell us, but you work for the 20%. We learn to do knee, elbow and open hand strikes, the one-handed push-away, two-handed push-away, side parry. Always maintain a reactionary gap, stay out of the fighting arc. Baton training, handcuff training and CS training. We are lined up on a field and sprayed in the face by an instructor in a gas mask. Coughing and howling, it feels as though chilies have been scrubbed into our eyes, mouth and nose. More commonly known as tear gas, CS is an incapacitant with a 3 to 10 foot range, 10 to 15 minute recovery time and a 1 in 10 failure rate. Whatever you do, don't try to CS a dog, the instructor tells us. You'll just make it angrier. Leg it or use a fire extinguisher. At the end of our training, at a ceremony attended only by ourselves, we are given warrant cards and sworn in as police officers, special constables, unpaid volunteers with full police powers who work at least 2 shifts a month. For the volunteer, it's an opportunity to learn something new. For the Met, it's a way to boost numbers on busy weekend evenings. I asked to be placed in Lambeth, the borough where I lived and where I had, until recently, worked as a primary school teacher. It's a long, narrow borough just south of the Thames, home to 250,000 people, and one of the most densely populated places in Britain. Among the other Lambeth specials are a banker, a bus driver, a printer, a civil servant, a supermarket manager, an HR director, a stay-at-home parent, a hospital receptionist, a stagehand, a custody officer, an executive PA, and a criminology student. In terms of age, ethnicity and gender, it is probably the most diverse group I have ever been a part of. All of the new Lambeth Special Constables were invited to a welcome briefing. Lambeth is London's, if not the country's, premier borough for policing. In terms of risk and excitement, we are right up there, the inspector said. I'd got a sense of its challenges from my time as a primary school teacher in Brixton. It consistently rates among the top boroughs for poverty, violent crime, gang activity and mental ill health. In a city of extremes, Lambeth stands out. You'll be spending a lot of time in Vauxhall, Clapham and Brixton, the inspector continued, 3 of the hottest spots in the Met. Brixton is an emotive word for everyone, of course, she said, alluding to the riots of 1981 and 85. Although relationships with the public are light years ahead of where they were 30, 40 years ago, and Stockwell has a slightly sadder recent history, she added. referring to the 2005 police shooting of Jean-Charles de Menezes, an innocent 27-year-old mistaken for a terror suspect 2 weeks after the 7/7 London bombings. The inspector looked around and began to wrap up. "You'll have an amazing time. You'll see more in a night than you would in a year in rural Hampshire. Get stuck in, get hands-on, that's the only way you'll learn. And enjoy it." Every Friday night, we would be put on patrol in either Brixton Town Centre, Clapham High Street or Vauxhall. For the first shift, though, we simply circled Lambeth in a van, 3 new specials in the back, 2 regular officers in the front, getting a flavour of what the borough had to offer. We did a sweep along Clapham High Street, looking for an unlicensed hot dog vendor who was notorious in the area, an IC2 Southern European male in his 60s who always worked Friday and Saturday nights, frying sausages and onions on a crudely welded sheet metal cart. "There he is, the bastard," our driver shouted. We scanned the pavement and spotted him, a short man with craggy features, tending a steaming silver hot plate. He was wearing black jeans, a black anorak, and a black beanie pulled down so low it covered his eyebrows. His eyes were on the hot plate, his face set in a stern, appraising expression. As we were parking, the hot dog vendor spotted us, dropped his tongs and ducked down a side street, his cart bouncing along the tarmac in front of him. We followed, brought the van alongside and rolled down a window, driving at his pace. The hot dog vendor kept jogging, looking straight ahead, as though he had not noticed us. We drove quietly next to him, waiting for his patience or puff to run out. After 20 metres, he stopped. "I'm working. Leave me alone." "Go home," we said, "or we'll confiscate your cart." We looped back to the high street and drove slowly up and down it. They called it talent spotting. "That one? Piss off, mate. How about that one? Not bad. That is not half bad. White high heels, tight leather skirt. I'd do her." There were debates about the quality of this arse or that arse, whether a face lived up to an arse or an arse to a face. "If you see a woman from behind," someone asked, "can you tell how fit her face will be just by looking at her arse?" During the shift, I had been discreetly making notes on my lap in the dark. I had been troubled by all of this from day one. Yet each time I encountered overt sexism, I did nothing more than write it down on a note card in the dark. I knew that if I'd encountered overt racism on a shift, I wouldn't have hesitated to report it. So what was it about casual misogyny that seemed less worthy of escalation? The answer was the same as when I was a teenager. These moments were the product of a culture so accepted that it seemed pointless to point it out. Senior officers must know, so why tell them? I wondered whether that was how some officers had felt in the face of overt police racism across the preceding decades. As my colleagues talked and laughed, I continued to write, then tucked the cards under my thigh, like a child, hiding a note from a teacher. Into the Night by Matt Lloyd Rose is read by Jack Paris and abridged and produced by Alexandra Quinn with Elizabeth Burke. It is a Loftus Media production.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
It was getting late and we were circling back streets when we spotted an IC3 black teen peering through the rear window of a white estate car. "It's hard," a special constable said. "You see a black guy alone at this time of night and you can't help thinking certain things." "What kind of things?" replied one of the regulars, "because that sounds a bit racist." As our van turned into a neighbouring street, a car alarm went off. We jumped out and ran back around the corner to find the boy in the driver's seat of the white car, jabbing the dashboard and talking breathlessly into his phone. He leapt from the car as we approached, and the nearest special, a mental health professional by day, flicked open his baton and raised it above his head. "Get onto the pavement! Get onto the pavement!" The boy complied, his eyes wide, his attention caught between us and his phone. "Hang up the phone!" "No, man, it's the owner. I'm speaking to the owner. It's the police," he said into the phone. "They think I'm stealing your car." He looked up at us. "I'm just moving the car for my uncle. He sells cars and he's put me on the company insurance so I can move vehicles for him." At 2 a.m? I know how this looks. We took details from the man on the phone and ran checks on the car. The boy produced the keys and we confirmed that he was on the insurance. He really was moving cars for his uncle. We all laughed and said goodnight. Back in the van, our driver turned around to look at us. "What was all that about? I come round the corner and it's all gone mental. Why did you pull out your baton? Can you justify that? I mean, for God's sake, I'm police, but that was pretty aggressive." Everyone I knew was surprised when I said I was going to join the police. I was surprised too. I'd never given a thought to policing and couldn't imagine myself doing it, but the decision was less haphazard than it appeared. For as long as I can remember, I've been fascinated by care, education, community and inclusion. I'd been the Year 3 teacher in the local primary school, a class of 30 7-year-olds, and I wondered about the connections between those small children and the boys and girls I saw on the streets at night. A couple of my pupils had older siblings in gangs, several had absent fathers, 2 had young fathers in prison. One of the boys, when he was 6, had been caught rolling make-believe spliffs from scrap paper, copying the gestures he saw his brothers making at home. My class was considered the most challenging in school. I'd never taught before and wasn't sure why I'd been given them. In our first lesson, a boy stood on his desk, shouted, "I'm King Kong!" and karate chopped another boy in the windpipe. While I tended to the injured boy, noise and movement erupted around me. I attempted to carry on with the lesson. "Shut up, you waste man!" someone yelled. My class had a reputation, but the extreme behaviour was as much a product of my inexperience, my inherent looseness and gentleness. A more capable teacher would have been sufficiently firm at the outset to avoid the loss of credibility and slide into chaos. As it was, I lost control and shambled through one lesson after another, attempting to reverse the vicious cycle. I was better prepared for my second term and, to begin with, posed as a rock-like authoritarian. In the first lesson, I kept a pupil in at lunchtime for writing in pen instead of pencil. I expected total obedience, overlooked nothing, and fixated on the most minor details. And I was surprised to see how much the children not only respected, but liked the structure and discipline. They knew where they stood, so they relaxed and acted like small children. Then I relaxed and acted more like myself, and we had a good year. I stopped teaching after 2 years and became an educational researcher. I loved watching other people teach, but I missed working directly with young people. I've also done stints at an elderly care home, a toddler group, a homeless shelter, a refugee mentoring programme, and a mental health helpline. I did it because I enjoyed it, but looking back, I can see that I was exploring the same set of questions from multiple angles. How do we live well together? What are our responsibilities to one another? How do we value and empower every individual at every stage of life? When I became a special constable, a volunteer with full police powers, I was attracted not so much by the role as by what police see and experience, their proximity to vulnerable groups at their most vulnerable moments. I thought policing might help me to think about how and how well our society was set up to tackle entrenched social issues. I wondered whose job it was to grapple with our most complex social challenges: homelessness, loneliness, gang violence, poverty, mental illness, domestic violence. And I suspected that the police were the people who confronted these issues at their most raw. I was intrigued to see how they responded to them. Thinking about it, I realised I was not even sure what the role of the police was in relation to these problems. I knew that the police tackled crime and kept order. I was not sure what they did with the rest of their time. We were back in the van for our next shift. Cold late autumn, night long fallen, when we set out at 7:30. Thousands of emergency calls are made in London every day. Processed centrally, they are transmitted to the relevant borough. There's a tall man screaming outside Clapham Common Tube. A woman's called from St George's Wharf. She says she's been punched by her husband. A unit's required at Max Roach Park. A group of males is fighting with sticks. Messy situations are stripped to essentials: people, problem, place. when we accept a call, we go to the address, meet the people, and hear the whole story. If another unit responds, that 5-second fragment is all we get. More calls. There's been a stabbing on the Stockwell Gardens estate. A handbag has been snatched outside Gypsy Hill train station. A unit's required to deal with a group of individuals who are picnicking in the middle of Streatham High Road. The police radio is a reminder that we are a tiny node in a vast network of activity, a structure we can sense but cannot see. Even with the volume low, we can hear the unfolding drama of crime and response. During my first shifts, I was fascinated by the radio, by the operators cataloguing the city's suffering. At times, it seemed like a random event generator, not just relaying situations, but inventing them. It took me a couple of shifts to realise the stories we hear on the radio are reports, not certainties. When a call comes in, we take it at face value, but it's not uncommon to rush to a giant street fight only to find an empty road. When we arrive at a location and there's nobody there, no indication as to whether what was reported took place, it can be hard to know the truth. On our next shift, we were sent to Clapham High Street on foot patrol, monitoring the Friday night crowds in the pubs and clubs. I was still getting used to the uniform, the beat helmet in particular, an elongated plastic cone that felt like it might topple off at any moment. It was neither comfortable nor functional, and I couldn't understand why we wore it, especially as it made us look faintly ridiculous. The public took us less seriously when we were wearing the helmet. Tourists asked to try it on, drunks tried to knock it off, and the female officer's bowler hat, although less of a direct target, scarcely commanded more authority. Over time, though, I realised that this was the point. Wearing funny hats. We were more approachable. They signalled that we are good-natured community servants, not an occupying force. They are a detail, their impact subliminal, but they reduce the distance between the police and the public. Every Friday night, thousands of people flock to the half-mile strip of Clapham High Street to drink and dance. They emerge from the tube stations with a look not just of relief, but of determination, as though they have come to settle a score. Then they drink in honky-tonk, dance in infernos, and end the night at KFC, the kebab company, or in the queue for an unlicensed hot dog. At 8 o'clock, the high street was already heaving. Our task was to walk back and forth until everyone went home again, to deal with any issues and remind the excited crowds that the eyes of the law were on them. Alcohol is a superb producer of crime. It provokes a degree of high spirits, violence, and confusion not ordinarily found outside a school playground. Alcohol distorts personalities and perspectives. The people who step off the tubes and buses are not the people who will leave 7 hours later. An IC1 white male, early 20s, rushed up to us, wide-eyed and out of breath. "My friend's just dropped his Oyster card and some guy's just picked it up and walked off with it." He pointed down an alley where two groups of intoxicated men were shouting at each other in an unlit car park. We walked towards them. "All right, guys, that's enough. Calm it down." We separated the groups, identified the man who had taken the Oyster travel card and insisted he return it. When he refused, we threatened to arrest him for theft. Weighing his options, he tossed the Oyster card onto the tarmac in front of him. Then he began to run around, shouting, I just got arrested for an Oyster card." He ran over to us. "I can't believe I just got arrested for an Oyster card." "You haven't been arrested," we said. "The best thing you can do now is go home." There was an argument on a traffic island between two IC1 white Northern European males, early 20s, one with a bloody mouth. "He's my boyfriend," the other said. "He's just been punched in Vodka Revs. He wants to report it, but I think we should just go home." "Give us a description and we'll go over and sort it out." No, come on, let's just go home and watch South Park." The man with the bloody mouth nodded and began to cry. His boyfriend put his arm around him and they walked towards the tube. Gone midnight, passing Infernos, we were approached by an IC1 female in a short black tassel dress. "What's the easiest way to get to Hammersmith from here?" The tube had stopped for the night and we didn't know the bus routes. She lifted her left foot and placed it on a garden wall. "Do you want to see my tattoo?" she said. Before we could reply, she had hitched her dress up to her waist to reveal a vibrant image covering her left thigh. The head of a sausage dog, wreathed by fruit and flowers. We stared in silence. It looked like a memorial to a much-loved pet. "It's my sister's dog," the woman said. "Is it dead?" we asked. "No," she said, "but I feel guilty. I was meant to be looking after it tonight. Now I'm worried about it and I don't know how to get home." We looked again at the dog on the woman's thigh. Its chin was raised, its eyes were wide, and it had a manic smile on its face. An IC1 male walked towards us and paused as he passed. "That looks well dodgy," he shouted. Patrolling the high street, watching the inebriated crowds, it seemed that the transformation alcohol offered was a return to the carefree, impulsive, present tense experience of childhood. There was a long queue at the illegal hot dog vendor's trolley. "You'd have to be pissed out of your head to eat that crap," my partner said. "God knows what's in those sausages." We looked on for a moment and then cut to the front of the line. "Mate, you need to pack up and leave." The hot dog vendor looked straight past us and continued to take orders. We stepped between the man and his customers, and he flapped his arms in exasperation, smacking his spatula onto the grill. I'm working," he said. "Go home," my partner replied. "I swear, if we see you around again tonight, we'll take your cart and we'll throw it in a skip." The hot dog vendor scowled, scraped the sausages into a cardboard box and wheeled his trolley down a side street. The queue remained in place for a few moments after he had left, hanging there until the news spread along it, and people drifted away. Into the Night by Matt Lloyd Rose is read by Jack Paris and abridged and produced by Alexandra Quinn with Elizabeth Burke. It is a Loftus Media production.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
We were out on patrol in Brixton town centre, a cold Friday in early January. Some people were starting their night out, others were still making their way home. There was a long queue at the cash point outside Sainsbury's and crowds at a dozen different bus stops. It was a standard Brixton scene. Busy, but unremarkable. As we were passing Nat West, an IC1 white European female, mid-20s, in business attire, walked briskly up to us and said that an IC3 black male, medium height, late teens, had just passed her holding a wad of bloody tissues to his face. We ran in the direction she was pointing, turned down a residential terrace and spotted two people on a street corner. The victim, Louis, was in his late teens, wearing black jeans, a black puffer and a black leather cap. Blood was seeping through the napkins he was holding to his jaw, and there was a trickle of blood running down his left cheek from his eye. With him was a black female, mid-teens, calling an ambulance and passing Louis fresh tissues. I'd never been the first responder at a stabbing before, and I'd always imagined that the experience would be noisy and horrific. Louis seemed so calm, applying pressure to his own wound, that the situation felt strangely undramatic. "This guy just came out of nowhere," Louis told us. "I thought he'd punched me in the face, but then I realised I was bleeding." He lifted up the napkins to reveal a gouge on his right cheek, an inch wide, which went down to the bone. He had been punched by someone holding a shard of glass. From the shape of the wound and the amount of flesh ripped out, the attacker must have twisted the shard before pulling it out. Did Louis know the man who had hit him? He did not. Could he describe him? Nothing detailed, just that the attacker was a black male with a scar on his face. A response car pulled up and an officer stepped out with a full first aid kit. She pressed a thick dressing onto the wound and wrapped a bandage around Louis's head, under his chin and over his scalp, around and around, until it looked as though he was wearing a wimple and his jaw was so tightly clamped that it was difficult for him to talk. Louis placed the bloody tissues he'd been holding on top of the hedge next to him. We kept telling him how well he was doing and that he was going to be fine, although he didn't look as if he needed the reassurance. When we found Louis, the girl looking after him had told us that she had seen what had happened. But when we looked for her after Louis climbed into the ambulance, our only witness had disappeared. Meanwhile, back on the high street, some regular officers had found blood spatters and cordoned off the area. My partner and I walked over there and took their places on the tape. Scores of people walked past us, most walking around the cordon without looking at it, some pausing to ask what had happened. I called to a group of IC3 males, late teens, sitting outside Ladbrokes, and asked whether they had seen anything. "We ain't seen nothing. Now move along, officer," said one. "It's not our job to tell you what happened," another said. "It's all on CCTV. Shouldn't you be looking at that?" We stood on the cordon, rocking backwards and forwards on our heels, frustrated we had missed the blood spatters, embarrassed we had lost our witness. We'd been standing on the cordon for 40 minutes when our lost witness walked up to us. "Do you remember me?" she said with a smile. "I was the one who was with him." I couldn't believe it, and I smiled and thanked her for coming back. We took down her details, her account of events, and a full description of the suspect. It turned out she had not been out with Louis that evening. She barely knew him. She was passing by when he was attacked and had stayed to check he was all right. She told us that an older black male, mid-30s, had smashed a brown beer bottle against the wall of an off-licence, then punched Louis in the face outside McDonald's with the broken bottle in his hand. "He's definitely involved with drugs and things, like all of them," the girl said. "So that's probably why he got stabbed." The girl's talk of smashing and shouting made it even more peculiar that nobody we had spoken to had noticed the stabbing. Was it possible that a person could be stabbed in the face at 8 in the evening without any of the hundreds of people present realising? One thing the girl's report established was that our cordon was in the wrong place. We had blocked off a section of pavement that Louis had bled onto, but not the crime scene itself, which had now been walked across by hundreds of people for almost an hour. When we looked around the corner, at the spot where Louis had been attacked, we found the remains of a brown bottle on the ground outside the off-licence. I went out for breakfast the next morning. Although Louis had seemed calm about the attack, I felt shaken. The blood spatters were still on the flagstone, sharp and clear in the morning light, although not so prominent that passers-by paused to look at them. I walked around the corner to the street behind. Louis's bloody tissues were still on top of the hedge. They would probably never be cleaned up. They would stay there until it rained, and they mulched into the leaves. For our next shift, we were assigned to Clapham High Street. It was still early in the evening, and the Friday night crowds were just ordering their first drinks. There wasn't much to do, so we did a sweep for people begging at the cash points. Although begging is illegal, we rarely arrest people for it. Instead, we move people on, a phrase that sounds euphemistic, but is entirely literal. When we ask someone to move on, that is all we expect them to do. We nudge the problem down the road. My partner told me that arresting a beggar can be a good technique for finishing a shift on time. "At a certain point in the evening," he said, "it's good to get off the streets so that you don't get drawn into something serious just before you're due to finish. There's this one chap, a prolific, aggressive beggar. He's got an ASBO. That means he's not allowed to beg, but he still does it all the time. He can be a really easy body at this time of the evening. You spot him and nick him, and you know that's you tucked up for the rest of the shift." It was not uncommon for people begging to get frustrated when we moved them on. They accused us of picking on them, told us there were more important things we could be doing than making their lives more difficult. Those who spend the most time on the streets are the most susceptible to policing. I was struck by the futility of our actions. Several of us were walking around Clapham looking for people begging. We had an opportunity to engage with people in need of support. What were we doing with it? Former Met Commissioner Robert Mark described the distinctive power of the police as the power to inconvenience. The inconvenience was meant to serve a greater purpose. Here, it seemed an end in itself. We were sent out in plain clothes to patrol a robbery hotspot. In uniform, we signal our presence, and people's behaviour changes accordingly. Patrolling in plain clothes was an exhilarating contrast. 2 men, a pair of white males, one late teens, one late 20s, ducked down the road right next to us. We were less than 5 metres away, looking straight at them, but we were in plain clothes, so there was no reason for them to notice. The younger man palmed some cash to the older one, took something, bent down, fiddled with his shoe, and emerged from the alley to slip back into the stream of late-night revellers. We let him walk a few metres, and then apprehended him, pulling out our warrant cards from the pockets of our casual clothes. "What were you doing with that man in the alley?" "We were just talking." "What about?" "Nothing, really." "It looked like you bought something and put it in your shoe." The young man's name was Alexander. He was 19 and had finished school a few months earlier. We searched him and found a heart-shaped pill in his left sock. "What's this?" "I don't know." "You bought it and you don't know what it is?" "It's probably MDMA, I guess. But I wasn't going to take it." He paused. "I didn't even buy it, actually. That guy just gave it to me. I was talking to him and he just gave it to me for free." He paused again. "Actually, he threatened me. He forced me to accept it, so I did, but I wasn't going to take it." The grimace on Alexander's face implied that even he was not convinced by this story. We arrested him and called for a van, then radioed our colleagues and asked them to go after the dealer. "Man, my dad is not going to like this," Alexander said. "He's going to be furious. You know, I'm supposed to be starting uni this autumn. History." "Were you going to take that pill?" "Probably, yeah." Standing next to Alexander, I thought about how arbitrary it was that I had seen this drug deal. A 10-second delay, a single divergent choice, and I would have missed it. I had versions of these thoughts on every shift. Stopping people, searching cars, coming across fights, smelling drugs, and knowing a different route would have yielded a completely different set of situations. Our colleagues had managed to apprehend Alexander's dealer just around the corner outside KFC. When they reappeared without him a few minutes later, we asked what had happened. "We didn't find any drugs on him, so we let him go." "What?" said Alexander. "So I'm the one that's been arrested?" A call came out. A black male on a bike had snatched a white female's handbag. We were near her flat and went round to take a statement and circulate a description of the robber. The young woman was badly shaken and couldn't give us much of a description. IC3 male, late teens, about 6 foot, in blue jeans and a grey hoodie. He had yanked her bag off her shoulder as she was walking home and ridden away before she could get a proper look at him. She stood in her kitchen crying, the heel of one hand pressed over her eyes, one foot crossed over another. She looked defeated. She had lost her bag, but she'd also lost, at least for now, her sense of life being safe and predictable. We filled out a victim care card and said someone would be in touch. "See this number?" my partner said. 8735, that's your unique number. It means that you were the 8,735th person to call the police today. That's in the whole of London. 8 million people. Hearing that number, I had a moment of vertigo, imagining the vast quantity of incidents the Met dealt with every week. I found it even stranger to think how similar many of them were to one another, the same few scenarios being played out over and over by different casts of characters. The patterns were so dependable. It was as though the incidents we attended were pre-programmed. Another robbery, another domestic, another drug deal. Working alongside regulars, it was clear that what seems dramatic at first does not remain so. The repetition was numbing. I'd been policing for 9 months when I stopped counting my shifts, and the things that happened on them began to merge in my memory. The nights in Brixton, Clapham and Vauxhall started to feel like one long night. The people we stopped, searched or helped were starting to meld. Apart from the illegal hot dog vendor, We saw him all the time. "You've got to admire his work ethic," our driver said. "Rain or shine, he's always out. He's crafty, mind. If you tell him to go home, he just wheels the cart around a bit, sets up somewhere else. I've thrown his sausages in the bin before, but as soon as you leave, he fishes them out and puts them back on the grill. Now when I see him, I take the valve off of his gas canister. That way, I know he'll have to stop." That night, we found him outside the tube. We told him to go home and watched as he scraped the sausages and onions into a cardboard box, placed it on a shelf under the hot plate, and wheeled his trolley away down Electric Avenue. Into the Night by Matt Lloyd Rose is read by Jack Paris and abridged and produced by Alexandra Quinn with Elizabeth Burke. It is a Loftus Media production.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Spring gave way to summer, and we were deployed to the South Bank for the evening, patrolling the most popular and iconic stretch of the Thames. After long nights in Brixton, Clapham and Vauxhall, it sounded like a glamorous assignment, giving directions to tourists, smiling for photos and chatting to the human statues. It was a fine evening, and for the first hour we walked back and forth between the London Eye and the National Theatre. Tourists smiled, took photos and asked where things were. Then a call came out. "There's a woman beating a man with a chain by the skate park on the South Bank." We were moments away and ran to the scene. When we got to the skate park, we found an IC1 white North European male, 50s, curled on the concrete, rocking and moaning. His left hand was outstretched to shield his face. The right was cradling a can of beer against his chest. A woman, also IC1, 50s, stood over him, swinging her dog lead high in the air before landing blow after blow on his back. A pit bull stood panting at her side. The skateboarders had stopped and a group of tourists had gathered to watch. A couple of people, with tight faces and springy knees, were hesitating on the verge of action. Others were filming the scene. Among the skaters and smartphones, the scene looked ancient and out of place, like the whipping of a drunken sailor. "Police, cut it out now!" We charged through them all, shouting at the woman to stop, grabbed her arms and locked them behind her back. "It's all right," the man said, standing up slowly. "Let her go. She's my girlfriend." We took the man to one side to check he was okay and to take a report. He shook out his arms, massaged his temples, and told us he didn't want to press charges. "You've just been badly assaulted," we said. "It's okay," he said. "Just leave us alone." We took down their details and ran name checks. When the checks came back clear, we let the couple go. The woman clipped the lead onto the dog's collar and put an arm round the man's shoulders. The man put his arm around her waist, and then the three of them walked away along the river, a blissful silhouette. I thought about the bystanders at the whipping who looked ready to act, who would surely have intervened if we had not appeared so promptly. Further along the South Bank, we encountered a white male, 50s, sobbing and shouting. "Tie me to the bed! Just rape me, will you? Rape me!" It was not clear whether he was appealing to one imagined listener or to the hundreds of tourists streaming past. Everyone acted as though he wasn't there. The strangeness of his howls and the completeness of his solitude in such a busy patch of London made him look as much like a performance artist as the human statues who surrounded him. The crowds knew what to do about the woman whipping her boyfriend, even if they were nervous about doing it. Nobody seemed to know what to do about the howling man. When the bars closed and the tourists drifted away, we returned to the van. I felt invigorated by the wide open space of the Thames, the big sky above it, the breeze along its banks. Driving back to the station in South London, it felt like I was returning inland, to noise and normality, small skies and tight streets. While we paused at a red light in Stockwell, an IC1 female, late 30s, knocked on the window. Her name was Tiffany, and she was heavily intoxicated. Tiffany had got off a bus believing she was near home, but when she realised that she wasn't even close, she had gone to a cash point to get money for a taxi, but someone had taken both her card and her cash. She slumped on the lip of the open window and began to sob. She lived a long way away. It seemed unlikely she would make it home safely without assistance, so the sergeant opened the side door and invited her into the van. We drove through central London, leaving Lambeth far behind. It felt like we were absconding, escaping our responsibility for the domestics and the stabbings, navigating streets that were someone else's problem. We were dedicating a lot of time and resources to helping one woman get home. Was that appropriate? How many other drunks in London would benefit from a lift? But Tiffany was the drunk we had bumped into. She had been robbed and, in the absence of anyone else, we had taken responsibility for her. We helped Tiffany phone her bank and freeze her debit card while driving to the far north of London to drop her home, chatting about her life and her work as a postwoman, walking as many miles in a shift as we did. After an hour, we pulled up to a suburban terrace. Tiffany climbed down and tottered along her front path. She unlocked her front door, turning to wave and smile before closing it behind her. Our driver swung the van around and began the long ride south. I couldn't square my reactions. On the one hand, it seemed a phenomenal waste of our time to spend 2 hours driving one drunk person home. On the other, those 2 hours felt more straightforwardly worthwhile than so much else we often did. I was surprised by the regular constable's willingness to do it. No one would have known if we had just left Tiffany to find her own way. Perhaps it was because this was a problem we could solve. We could feel useful. We could be kind. It was all, for that moment, very simple. Walking the beat, beating time, beating the bounds of a patch of North Lambeth. As we walked, I thought about what a strange term beat is for walking the streets. A word that suggests rhythm, violence, exhaustion, competition, and the pulsing of a heart. I wasn't sure what it had to do with police officers doing the rounds, walking miles in a confined area, miles that would have taken us from one side of London to the other if walked in a straight line. Back on patrol near Clapham High Street, we walked in 12 pairs, passing the other officers over and over again. Turning a corner, we saw a white van with its back doors open. It was the hot dog vendor, yet again, arriving for the evening, and a younger white South European male who, from the way he was talking to the vendor, appeared to be his boss. They were lowering his cart onto the pavement and preparing to load it with sausages, ketchup and rolls. They stopped suddenly when they saw us, eyes wide and mouths open like children caught with the biscuit tin. We told them to put the cart back in the van and go home. Without saying a word, they did as we asked, although we knew they would drive to Brixton or Vauxhall and set up there instead. I arrived one week for my shift to find Brixton Station abuzz with the story of a female officer who had single-handedly broken up a fight between two large groups of drunk white males, running between them with her baton raised, shouting at them to back off. "She's got more balls than the rest of you put together," a sergeant said. At the briefing, we were given a pile of arrest warrants for people who were wanted or had breached their bail conditions. It would probably take most of the evening to round them up and get them booked into custody. "Nice, easy bodies," the inspector said. "Go to their houses, grab them and bung them in Brixton Nick." Our first suspect was known for drugs and violence against police and lived on the Angel Town estate. 4 of us stood poised around the entrance and knocked loudly. The door was opened by a short, softly spoken IC4 South Asian female in her 40s. When we told her why we were there, she picked up her handbag from the hall table, pulled the door closed behind her, and shuffled out to be arrested. We called the custody van and 2 colleagues took her back to the station. Just before 9 p.m, we pulled up at a mock Tudor terrace. Takesha, an IC3 black 15-year-old, was watching cartoons in the front room with her 2 little sisters. All 3 were in matching pink dressing gowns, faces flickering in the dark. When we knocked, their foster mother invited us in, turned on the big light and muted the TV. Takesha had breached bail earlier that week, we announced, and we were there to arrest her. We stood between the sofa and the television and explained that Takesha would spend the night in a cell in Brixton Police Station and face a magistrate in the morning. Above the top of one of Takesha's pink slippers, we could see a thick black bangle, an electronic tag, fitted after she had been convicted for taking part in gang robberies, a digital ball and chain that kept her at home every night from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. The arrest warrant showed that earlier that week, Takesha had arrived home an hour after the start of her curfew. "I was at a meeting that ran over," she told us. "It was with my youth worker. That's the reason I got back late. It actually wasn't my fault." We explained that, regardless of the reason, we had a warrant and were compelled to arrest her. "But I was with my youth worker," she insisted. Her youth offending team were aware of her bail conditions, we told her, and we had no choice. The point of the youth offending teams is to help young people navigate the legal process and to steer them away from crime. If what Takesha said was true, this was an unfortunate slip on their part. The experience of interacting with multiple agencies can be confusing for young offenders, being cared for one moment, disciplined the next. For police officers, teachers, youth workers, social workers, the experience can be confusing too. Unresolved issues are handed from one institution to the next, looping and growing until both state and individual are caught in a vicious spiral they struggle to see a way out of. I arrested Takesha in the living room, sitting with her sisters on the couch, her foster mother in the doorway, cartoons playing silently behind me. "You do not have to say anything," I said, "but it may harm your defence if you do not mention when questioned anything which you later rely on in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence." "It's not fair," Takesha shouted. "What are you taking me away for? I told you I had a meeting." She went upstairs to change and we waited in the hall, talking to her foster mother. "I understand, officers," she said. "We all want the best for her." Takesha came back downstairs slowly, landing heavily on each step. At the bottom, she told us she was ready to go and swung a studded black handbag over one shoulder. At Brixton Police Station, we presented Takesha to the custody sergeant and checked in her belongings, emptying her bag onto the counter and listing each item. Purse, keys, phone, hair clips, gum, Oyster card, tampons, lip gloss, headphones, a biro, some strands of braided plastic. We were about to log a loose, cheesy what's-it when Takesha told us to throw it away. We sealed the handbag and its contents into a clear plastic sack and handed it to the sergeant. We had almost finished at the desk when a black female, 40s, in handcuffs was escorted into the custody suite. She looked over at Takesha. "Keep smiling, girl," she shouted. Takesha smiled at the woman, who then looked away and began muttering, "She's got to keep smiling, got to keep smiling, got to keep smiling," before bursting into a hysterical drunken cackle. We could hear a skirmish outside, a prisoner kicking off, an officer trying to calm him down. Stop struggling! Why are you covered in shit? Is it your shit?" We got Takesha some blankets and some water and left her in her cell. Into the Night by Matt Lloyd Rose is read by Jack Paris and abridged and produced by Alexandra Quinn with Elizabeth Burke. It is a Loftus Media production.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
The Friday before Christmas, thousands of office parties, the most drunken night of the year, Vauxhall was overrun. On Goading Street, making the most of the occasion, we found the unlicensed hot dog vendor. Yet again, we dismissed his customers and ran a name check on him. When we had confirmed that he was not currently wanted, we told him to pack up and go home. "What's your problem?" he said. "You got nothing better to do?" But he scraped the sausages into a box and wheeled the cart away. This was going to be one of my final shifts. My wife and I were moving to South America with her work. I had handed in my resignation to the Met, and in a few weeks' time I would return my uniform and warrant card. It was going to be a lively evening. Already at 8:30, the atmosphere was raucous. An IC1 white North European male was urinating in a hedge a few feet away from us. "Mate, are you aware that there's a public urinal less than 100 metres away?" "Say no more, officers," the man replied with a wink, and ran in the direction we were pointing. Looking around, crowds everywhere, people shouting and running, I felt overwhelmed. It was chaos. I knew, though, that my bewilderment was really a form of illiteracy, an inability to sift and decode what I was seeing. I was patrolling with an experienced regular. She could see patterns and abnormalities invisible to my eyes, troubling behaviour, simmering tensions, people in places you wouldn't expect them. Great policing is a mysterious blend of knowledge, skill, manner, judgment, outlook and values that can be difficult to pick apart. I asked the regular about her approach. "I genuinely believe in prevention rather than cure," she replied. "If you talk to someone early on in the evening, they're much more likely to get on with you if you pull them out of a club later on. I joined the job 14 years ago, and in all that time, I've never been assaulted. Policing is all about getting on with people, and not enough officers think like that." She kept pausing to chat to people, conducting short stops, but without them feeling like stops. She was intelligence gathering, but she was also just being friendly. Over the early part of the evening, she must have greeted several hundred people, imprinting our presence onto their minds, affecting their outlook and behaviour in small but significant ways. "Cheers, we'll be around all evening," she said at the end of each interaction. She was assertive, while still sounding warm and sincere. I asked her how she saw her colleagues. 50% of officers are good," she said. 25% are truly excellent. And 25% are in this job for all the wrong reasons, and they're the ones that the public remembers. Outside Chariot's Roman Spa, we spotted an IC3 black male, late teens, wearing a white apron and setting up an oil drum barbecue. On the pavement around him were packets of napkins, bottles of water, polystyrene cartons, plastic cutlery and Tupperware full of jerk chicken. He was busily laying out his wares, getting ready for the crowds that would come pouring out over the coming hours. We walked over and explained that it was illegal to sell food on the street without a licence. The young man was silent for a moment, then looked at us. "I'm at college. I've done all my health and safety stuff." "That may be," my partner said, "but you can't sell food on the street without a licence." "I'm just trying to make some honest cash. Look at this. It's jerk chicken, not crack. I've got all my stuff ready." He paused, his facial expression changing several times in quick succession, his mouth opening then closing as his desire to argue battled with his hope that not arguing might improve the chances of us leaving him to it. "Look, I've got literally 300 chicken thighs I need to cook tonight." He went quiet and waited for us to say something. My partner took out her phone and showed him the local council website explaining how to register as a street trader. "This is no judgment on your cooking," she said. "We admire the entrepreneurialism, but you need to pack up. The regulations are there for a reason." The young man disassembled his barbecue in silence and loaded the napkins, water, cartons, cutlery and tubs of raw chicken back into the boot of his car. "Shame that," my partner said as we walked away. "I hate to crush a young person trying their best." "Why not turn a blind eye?" I asked. "Slippery slope," she said. "The rules are there for everyone. They exist for a reason. That chicken could be full of salmonella. Probably not, but it's not impossible. Then you've got a mass poisoning just because we wanted to be nice to someone." My experiences made me think that at the heart of policing, the quality most needed is care. Caring for fragile people at moments of extreme stress and caring about intractable seeming issues, even as they thwart your attempts to solve them. The police, the vehicle for force in society, are handed not just society's most physically risky situations, but also its most complicated caring duties. Most officers liked chasing, catching, rescuing, not the messy, ongoing work of care. But whether we liked it or not, that was the work. Most of our urgent calls were not aberrant one-offs. The emergencies of community policing are slow-motion emergencies, playing out over months or years. They need sustained care, not sporadic bouts of control. For my final shift, I'd signed up to patrol Brixton with the neighbourhood policing team. I wanted to stay close to the ground, to walk a farewell lap of the streets where I had lived and taught and policed for almost 6 years. I was paired with a regular who had been policing Lambeth for 3 decades. Unlike his colleagues, he preferred this slow, fine-grained work, encountering the same vulnerable families and individuals again and again, helping them to improve things bit by bit. "It suits me down to the ground," he told me as we walked to the Tulse Hill estate to make house calls, beginning with a family with learning difficulties, whose grown-up son had been repeatedly bullied, burned with a lighter and robbed. The young man welcomed us in, and the family told us how they were doing, that things had been slightly better recently. While the parents spoke, their son bustled around the kitchen, emptying and filling the pockets of his fleece jacket, taking little plastic bags out and then putting them back in again. He likes to keep his pockets full of little bags stuffed with paper tissues, the regular told me as we left. Such a sad situation, that one. They're good as gold, but some people just won't leave them alone. We wove between the high brown brick blocks, nodding to people as we passed. The regular gestured at a pair of flats next door to each other. "We've been dealing with a neighbour dispute there for 9 years now," he said. "It's the never-ending story." We walked slowly through the corridors and courtyards of the estate. I knew my way around now. I would forget it again soon. I'd probably never come in here again. I thought about everything I'd seen with the police, the domestics, the stabbings, the homelessness, the loneliness. They seemed to resist attempts to understand them. They were like wet knots. We tug at them, but nothing gives. They tighten. I'd sensed these frustrations as a teacher, as a volunteer in a homeless shelter, and I felt them most keenly as a police officer. These issues are bigger than any single institution. We passed a white van with the word absurd spray-painted on one side. Looking along Effra Road, we could make out a Jack Russell disrupting the traffic, weaving between the vehicles in breathless spurts. 4 lanes of buses, vans, bikes and cars stopped, started, honked and swerved. The regular and I ran into the road, waving our arms to stop the traffic, trying to grab the dog. Drivers leaned out of their windows, eyes lifted from phones at a bus stop. The Jack Russell saw us approaching and bolted away, invigorated by the chase. We kept running, struggling to get anywhere near it, feeling ridiculous, aware that people were filming. After several aborted attempts, we managed to trap the dog along the side of a number 2 bus, catching it with a pincer movement, and carried it to the pavement, smiling at a ripple of applause. "He lives just over there," a passerby said to us, pointing at a brown brick terrace. When we knocked on the owner's door, she was surprised. She hadn't realised the dog had got out and looked at us accusingly, as though we had just abducted it. She took the Jack Russell, held it tightly to her chest, and closed the door without a word. A few days later, my wife and I flew to South America for her new job. In the 4 years we were living abroad, we had a daughter, and then, soon after our return to London, we had a son. We moved back to our flat in Brixton. Returning home late one evening, I climbed the steps from Brixton Tube and smelled onions and frying meat. I looked around for the source of the smell, and there, next to the pedestrian crossing, was the illegal hot dog vendor who I'd seen almost every night when I'd been on patrol. I was stunned. How had he managed to keep this up? After all the pressure, the confiscations, the fines, I felt amusement, even affection. Here he was, unperturbable, still serving unlicensed meat to the masses. He'd even upgraded his cart. It now had electric lighting and proper signage. The words "Jumbo Hot Dog" printed above a perfectly proportioned sausage and bun. Did the upgrade mean that his carts were no longer being taken off him? Were his old carts rusting in the backyard of Brixton Police Station? I paused and looked him in the eye. He looked back, but there was no recognition. He looked away and tossed the onions with his spatula. It felt strange to encounter the hot dog vendor without my warrant card. I had nothing up my sleeve. I was just a former teacher, a former police officer, and now I was a local dad, reading Cops and Robbers to my children. Things had got worse since we left. Knife crime was rife. Young people were killing one another at an unprecedented rate, and no one seemed to know what to do. The issues were the same, but the stakes were higher. Our small flat felt claustrophobic with the 4 of us in it. Each night I walked circles around our small lounge with my baby son in my arms, walking its perimeter hundreds of times, keeping a steady pace, a light bounce in my step to send him back off to sleep. I listened to the traffic on Brixton Hill, to the screech of foxes, to distant sirens. Every now and then a response car passed the lounge window, bathing the room in blue light. I was always surprised that the siren and the alien light didn't bother my son. I walked around and around the coffee table, singing the same songs hundreds of times, trying to wear him down with repetition. When his eyes were closed, his body loose and heavy, when I was sure he was asleep, I would tiptoe to his cot and lay him down, praying that the stillness would not shock him awake. Sometimes nothing made a difference, so I just kept walking, my head nodding, my eyes half shut, waiting for the night to end. Into the Night by Matt Lloyd Rose is read by Jack Paris and abridged and produced by Alexandra Quinn with Elizabeth Burke. It is a Loftus Media production.